Hello, welcome to Sky News live online with a special on the Manchester City investigation by the Premier League. I'm Rob Harris, sports correspondent, and have been following this very long-running saga. It's complex, it's contentious, but it's got so many talking, not just among football fans, but consequences far beyond football as well, as the Premier League takes on its current most successful team, a team that's won 8 titles since 2012. What is this case all about? Well, they're accused of more than 100 alleged breaches of financial rules in the Premier League dating back to 2009. And over the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to attempt to explain what is behind this case, what happened in the hearings. It was towards the end of last year that the hearings took place. They took 12 weeks, the Premier League's lawyers up against Manchester City's lawyers, and 12 weeks on from the conclusion of those hearings, we still have no outcome. City fans hoping to determine what will their future be. Rival fans perhaps hoping for a huge points deduction for Manchester City, maybe even relegation from the Premier League. And against the backdrop of all this, Manchester City are struggling on the pitch too, very unusually out of the Champions League, way out of the Premier League title race, and how perhaps they'd wish for the unrestricted spending that all these financial rules prevent. Just as a very quick précis of what these rules entail. Since 2011, when financial fair play was introduced by European football's governing body, clubs could only spend legitimately earned income from sponsors, from broadcasters and prize money on players. They couldn't, though, just inject a load of money into the club, however wealthy the owners are. And that put intense scrutiny on sponsorship deals. So as well, clubs could only, and still can only, have sponsorships at fair market value. So if one airline would pay a certain amount for a sponsorship for a club, well, that would be benchmarked against what a club like Manchester City, with its Abu Dhabi backing, can bring in as revenue. Because at the heart of it is the fact Manchester City do have this intense wealth since 2008 by Sheikh Mansour, Vice President of the United Arab Emirates. It transformed the whole trajectory of the club from underachievers, from living in the shadow of Manchester United, to becoming the dominant player perhaps in English football at the moment. So we're going to try to guide through some of the issues. We're here at the FT Business of Football Summit. So many of the power brokers in world football are here in central London. So many insiders, so many journalists, and we're going to talk to them as well to get their thoughts, as well as receiving some of your questions. So who have I got alongside me? Matt Hughes, renowned journalist, and Simon Leaf, head of sport at Mishcon D'Orea, sports lawyer. So have you ever seen a case quite as complex as this?
I mean, this is truly unprecedented in the history of football and financial regulation in football, which really only kind of dates back kind of 10 to 15 years or so. We've never quite seen anything like it, and I think with the kind of Man City kind of charges that we have, because of the profile of the club, but also the number and breadth of the charges, it's likely to be a pretty lengthy judgment that we see coming out from the panel. As an example, you only have to look at what happens with Everton and Forest and other clubs over the years, that where they've been charged with relatively kind of few breaches of the rules, you will see kind of decisions that can run into the tens, if not hundreds of pages, and it's a really kind of complicated area. So there'll be plenty of lawyers, dare I say, kind of poring over the words and seeing exactly what the panel have said when they do indeed make that decision.
We'll delve into some of the details of what we know about the case. Matt, you've reported on football for many years. When you started out, could you imagine this sort of intense focus on the law, the finances, the arbitration battles that we're in now, and how much of an issue is it for English football, the fact that we're in this constant sense of gridlock in these legal battles?
Even 5-10 years ago, I couldn't have imagined journalists, football fans arguing over arcane matters of competition law and issues such as associated party transactions. It feels like the last 10 years of the Premier League is all sort of crystallised in this one case. And I know as journalists, football commentators, we are in the hype industry, but it's hard to overstate the importance of this case for the Premier League, for Man City, for the country. There are so many strands, all brought into the fact that Man City are owned by Abu Dhabi, a trading partner of the government. So it goes. The story encapsulates everything from grassroots football to foreign policy at the highest level.
Yeah, and what this ultimately relates to is, in the years after the takeover, Manchester City started to spend a lot, these financial rules came in place, so the Premier League, while we haven't had the specifics of what they're accused of doing, we have some details that we can glean from it, because this was all sparked by the publication of football leaks in 2018. A Portuguese person who Manchester City say illegally obtained internal correspondence showed that money might have been filtering around Abu Dhabi to effectively fund some of these sponsorships artificially. City deny wrongdoing. They say they have an irrefutable body of evidence, comprehensive body of evidence that can irrefutably prove their case. So there are many strands to it we'll get to, but some people messaging us think, well, they're going to get away with it, rich lawyers will find a technicality, and there'll be no punishment at all. Given what we've seen from some of these perhaps less complex cases, whether it's Everton or Nottingham Forest, on single breaches of profit and sustainability rules, would even just a few potential guilty verdicts lead to a big points deduction?
It's very interesting. We don't actually know for certain the number of charges. The headline figure was 115, but we've heard since that it could be 129 or 130. Some people involved in trying the UEFA case against Man City think the Premier League have made a mistake in throwing everything at City, and they could have tried to get them on one or two charges, which would have demonstrated guilt and led to a significant punishment. If they're found guilty of anything, the Forest and Everton thresholds established at 4 and 6 points suggest that City are in for a huge points deduction. But we don't know if that can be, if the Premier League's case can be proven.
If you've got any questions, send them in. If you're watching on YouTube or X, you can put them in the comments below and we'll try to answer them as we delve into the Manchester City case. Simon, as a sports lawyer, summarise, what is this case all about? There are so many separate strands. One whole part of it is about not cooperating, but then the rest of it is about whether there were side payments alleged and inflated income.
Absolutely. It's almost a question of where do you start. I mean, the bottom line is that the Premier League has had a form of kind of financial regulation, kind of commonly known as FFP, for over a decade now. And the crux of it gets to whether Man City have breached those rules, whether they've tried to hide payments that have been made, so we understand to other parties that should have been kind of on the books but actually were off the books. And then coupled with that, you've got these kind of accusations around actually kind of complying with the kind of Premier League and disclosing the information that they've asked for so that they are able to kind of investigate these allegations. And so, really there's a whole kind of plethora of kind of issues that the Premier League have had to look at here. A lot of these allegations date back several years, which again is kind of problematic in itself because, as we know, kind of titles would have been awarded many times over, and so if they are found to be in breach of the rules, you then have this potential kind of can of worms where clubs that did comply with the rules during that period would potentially look at what has happened and say, well, actually, should that have been my title? Should I have qualified for the Champions League or whatever it may be? So it really could be a kind of further can of worms that then gets opened up from a kind of legal and regulatory perspective as well.
I suppose there's two parts to it. One is whether or not income was somehow disguised in Abu Dhabi, and the accusation is that perhaps one company related to Sheikh Mansour was paying another and repaying it, of which City deny wrongdoing. The other is about inflated sponsorship value as well, which is quite hard to determine, isn't it? How legitimate is it for Etihad, for instance, the Abu Dhabi state carrier, to pay one amount and another club say, well, actually, City don't actually deserve that value of the sponsorship?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're seeing at the moment with the kind of current APT hearings and the challenges, because ultimately the rules were changed a few years ago to try and kind of capture the fact that you may have kind of what was previously associated parties, now related parties, that are willing and have got deeper pockets and willing to pay over the odds for deals. And sorry, but ultimately, is that fair if you do have an owner that is willing to kind of put more money in that way, or you do have parties that are related to the owner that can do that? And so, what it then kind of comes down to is trying to assess what the market value is on those kind of transactions. And as somebody that regularly kind of negotiates these kind of big sponsorship deals or kind of shirt sponsorship deals, naming rights deals, it's very hard to kind of say, what should the value be for a shirt sponsorship deal with one club compared to the other, because I guarantee you no two sponsorship deals are ever the same. There's always a certain issue that kind of comes up in one deal that isn't in another. Equally, the rights are never quite the same. Everything from having kind of corporate hospitality access to players, all the way through to one of the deals we did a few years ago involved the country's kind of national ballet being able to kind of appear at the stadium. How do you put a value on something like that? So these are very kind of complicated matters. Yes, the Premier League will say that they've got kind of experts on it and they have independent valuers that will try and do that work, but it's a very difficult job to actually say that something should have cost this rather than that, and that's been the crux of some of the more recent kind of challenges that we've seen.
Many questions coming in, and the heart of this as well is some sports struggle to attract investment. Here you have owners who willingly put lots of money in to the clubs, but the competitions have determined that for competitive balance, to ensure an exciting competition, that it's better to restrict that investment, so you don't just have one team perhaps running away with it. Let's go to some of your questions that are coming in. Here's maybe it's a simple one, it's a short one but a complex answer. Adam asks, if City are found guilty, could or should they have some of their titles stripped from them? And we've expanded our squad here as well. Martin Lipton from The Sun as well, so maybe a quick one going round. Are they going to rewrite history in any eventuality and strip titles?
I don't think they will. From the people I've spoken to, there seems to be no appetite to take retrospective punishment, and any punishment enforced will be moving forward.
I think it's too early to tell. We don't know what the outcome's going to be. I suspect, as I say, particularly when money's involved, that there will be certain clubs looking at this and saying, well, actually, I would have been entitled to payments, for qualifying for the Champions League, for merit payments in the table, or even kind of bonuses from sponsors for finishing in a different position. So I would say it's too early to really kind of...
Martin?
Well, I think first of all you say that there's obviously the possibility of clubs making compensation claims against City were they to be found guilty under the rule book as it stands. But if you were to strip titles, for example, the single most iconic moment in the history of the Premier League, Sergio Aguero's 94th minute goal against QPR to win the league, didn't happen because that got them third. It's not going to happen. You can't rewrite history to that extent. I think the expectation, and it's a big ask actually, because effectively for City to be found guilty, there have to be proven to by an effective court of law, 3 senior former judges who are sitting on the panel, that they deliberately defrauded football, that they not only broke the rules, but they deliberately broke the rules and then maintained that lie over an extended period. Now that's a huge ask. If they are found guilty, and I'll be surprised, I have to be honest, just because of the gravity of those allegations, the punishment would be huge. It would be enormous points deductions, massive fines, etc. But it would have to be, as Matt said, things going forward. You can't re-litigate over the past in football. I don't think that's viable or valid.
Because the players themselves aren't accused of any wrongdoing. It's it's not like their integrity is being questioned in any way. It's about how the squad was assembled, the finances for it. Let's go through another one. Lots of people asking about those titles and whether they'd be stripped. Does it really matter, Gavin asks, what the penalty is, since surely City are just going to use their army of lawyers to appeal this endlessly? Are we actually going to get an outcome this year, or will the definitive verdict be many years down the line?
I don't think we'll get a definitive outcome. We're hoping to get an initial judgment next month, but it's not clear what that looks like, if there's going to be any sanctions involved in that, or if there will need to be a second separate sanctions hearing. And even if there is, I would imagine, depending on the outcome, either party is likely to appeal. So I don't think this will be resolved for a long time.
Yeah, is it going to go into next year?
Yeah, look, I think technically there will be very narrow grounds that will be available for them to appeal, but that, in my view, wouldn't stop either side from appealing if they don't quite like the outcome. I think when what we saw with kind of APT 1 was an outcome that both sides could quite legitimately point to and say that was a victory for them. I think it's much harder with something like this to find an outcome that both sides would be legitimately happy with. And so, City themselves have suggested that even if they were found guilty of, or in breach, of one particular charge, they would potentially try to appeal that. And I suspect that it'll be very hard to kind of get to an outcome that both sides would look at and say, right, well, that's the end of the story. We don't need to kind of take this further. Purely looking at what's happened even over the last few weeks with some of the challenges that have been going on, there's clearly no love lost between either side.
I suppose one of the things linked to this, and we heard it while Steve Parish, the Crystal Palace chairman, wasn't directly referring to the City case on a panel here, was why is football being dragged through the courts to the nth degree? And you hear around, which is these rules were never set up to be microscopically challenged like this.
I think that's true. I mean, there's always been an understanding of a gentleman's agreement that the rules are a little private members' club. And that's always been the case for the 150 years of football, that the rules were agreed rather than being imposed. This is why, of course, there was such a shock for the likes of Everton and Forest when suddenly the PSR rules that everyone thought was a custom more honoured in the breach than the observance were actually suddenly being enforced. And it changed the minds. And of course, once you start to litigate, to impose and enforce rules, lawyers are going to be engaged to try to wriggle out of it, because the nature of any sporting organisation is that they want to win, and they don't like being punished. And we know that all Premier League meetings are all about whether it's in the interest of my club or might damage them, whether things get voted through, rather than for the greater good. It's not about that. It's self-interest, which is understandable. And if you are looking at huge sums of money being at risk, any club would understandably and justifiably think, well, how can we avoid this happening to us? And the obvious way of avoiding it is to go to court. What is interesting is that under the Premier League rule book, there's an established principle. So there's lots of threats of we will go to the High Court if we lose. The High Court might just refuse jurisdiction, because there is an established tribunal process where it goes to a panel and then a potential appeal, and that's supposed to be the final arbiter. And though the High Court could be appealed to, for example, they might just say, well, no, we're not going to get involved because of these reasons.
Interesting, we're getting a lot of questions in by the Sky News app, people watching us live on there. This one actually from Louis raises the prospect of City being found innocent, and to get into that detail in a second, interesting what innocent might look like. The UEFA case linked to the same Football Leaks evidence in 2020. City were initially banned from the Champions League. They succeeded in overturning that by saying and proving that some of the evidence was time barred, effectively it happened too long ago, the allegations, for it to be judged against. But City were still fined €10 million for their obstruction of the case. So I suppose, as we get onto one of these points from Louis about what about some of the journalists that, they're saying slandered City. Maybe first, what innocent could look like. Obviously, if they're completely exonerated, could City have grounds, they're saying it, maybe to, get compensation, take action against the Premier League for dragging them through this?
Well, you wouldn't be surprised if they did. I mean, I think it'd be difficult for them to avoid being found guilty of obstructing the Premier League inquiry in the same way they were found guilty in the UEFA case. But of course, they will argue, well, we did, because the Premier League were exceeding their authority and were delving into things that weren't wrong, and why should we help somebody to prosecute us via a rule book that is flawed, shouldn't exist, and puts the actual existence of the Premier League into question. So that would be a perfectly legitimate position for City to say, actually, well, we've won this case in the key moments, the things that really matter. We want some extra compensation. But of course, that would be probably just who pays the costs, and the way that is determined will be the biggest indicator, as it will be with the APT case, where that balance of who pays the costs is paid. If City were to be cleared of absolutely everything, which I think is unlikely just because of what we've seen from the UEFA case, then there's no question about the next question will be what happens to the Premier League leadership? Because let's fair, it's pretty clear to all of us that it's not any longer a case of no love being lost. It's brutal civil war, and Manchester City want decapitation of the entire leadership of the Premier League. They want them out.
And rival clubs unhappy about the legal bill rising to almost £50 million last season as well.
We are unhappy, but interestingly, they appear to have fallen in behind the Premier League in this fight with City in the vote over amending the APT rules in November. 16 clubs voted with the Premier League against City, Newcastle, Aston Villa, and I think Nottingham Forest, and that was the strongest quorum of support the Premier League have had. I think there actually is a lot of sympathy from the Premier League amongst the other clubs, and while they're unhappy with various issues regarding the leadership, they're aware that it's a very, very difficult job, and whoever came in would almost face an impossible task.
It's interesting, a question of admissibility. The reason we're talking about this is because Rui Pinto gained access to all this internal correspondence. Now, some of it was used in tax proceedings in Spain. It led to settlements involving very famous players like Cristiano Ronaldo. And I suppose some at City say, should we be relying on this sort of evidence that City would say has been illegally obtained?
Yeah, well, look, technically, both the Premier League and the EFL have very kind of clear rights under their rules to be able to request all information from clubs. And I think the EFL go as far as saying if you don't provide it within, I think it's kind of 5 business days or something very, very short as that there's a kind of transfer embargo that may be applied straight away. So, yeah, it's interesting to kind of see why the Premier League didn't potentially go down that route. And if they weren't receiving the information, or they didn't think they were getting the right information, imposing some kind of interim punishment on the club until they did get the information they were looking for. And ultimately, as a league, it's a group of members. They're all the clubs have agreed to these rules that apply, albeit not unanimously, as we've seen kind of more recently. But that whole system relies on the league being able to act as the kind of policeman, if you like, and kind of look and kind of really kick the tyres as to what's going on if they suspect that clubs aren't kind of fully complying with the rules. And yeah, I think that's what we're seeing here now. Ultimately, must have been a frustration with the Premier League, on the part of the Premier League, that they just didn't feel like they were getting the information that they were entitled to.
I suppose that's the thing as well, the obligation on City to fill in the blanks, the bits of the correspondence that we couldn't see published by Der Spiegel in Germany, and so many questions about whether it should be reported, some actually saying a message that's perhaps emerged from within City, but what would happen if we saw the internal correspondence of other clubs as well? And we know, there has been a case involving Chelsea that's been ongoing about sort of transfer activity, which they deny wrongdoing on. So it's interesting if they start to sort of throw that point around, which was, why are we being clicked on?
That's the equivalent of saying, well, I was going at 40, but he was going at 50. It's irrelevant to you when you're in the courtroom if the speed limit was 30. I mean, what somebody else was doing is not something that can really be taken into. You may put that into account if you're found guilty in the sentencing to ask whether or not there should be more context. But the specifics of the case are, did they or did they not? And they vehemently, absolutely and totally refute all the allegations. Did they or did they not break the rules? And there is that interesting thing about in the Premier League rule book that clubs are obligated to act with good faith, utmost good faith. So that again has been taken as you're supposed to tell the truth. But we are talking football here, and nobody tells the truth. It's football.
Well, it's interesting what you say, though, because one of the points you made before around the general expectation that for years, because we hadn't had any kind of charges like this, it really was unprecedented, that clubs felt that they were almost kind of above the law, so to speak. And generally there was a much more kind of collaborative approach where the Premier League weren't looking to kind of trip people up. But obviously, with what happened with the Super League and then the Tracy Crouch review and then the spectre of an independent regulator, I do get the sense that
Premier League felt forced to take action under his own rule,
and to be able to show that actually we can kind of regulate ourselves, and in the process they've kind of shown themselves to be a little naive, if I can say that, when it comes to dealing with those kind of clubs. And you only have to look at what happened with Leicester, for example, and the embarrassment that was caused to the league by the fact that its own rules didn't seem to kind of cater for clubs being promoted and relegated. That actually there probably does need to be a rethink, and if anything, they've kind of played into the hands of the people that were saying we do need a regulator, we do need somebody independent to come in and actually act as the kind of say policeman or overlord. I mean, the irony though is that actually with the regulator, day to day when it comes to these kind of regulations, they won't actually sit with the regulator, and that's in some way perhaps a missed opportunity. Because
the regulator will be about financial oversight of clubs generally, not the specifics of each individual competition.
Yeah.
And interestingly, here at the conference, we've been hearing criticism about the regulator yet again from Steve Parish, the Crystal Palace chair, warning of unintended consequences. Another question that's come in on the Sky News app: is it the same body who decides if there's been breaches of the rules? Is the same body who decides on the breach of the rules the same one that decides on the punishment as well?
Yes, the same panel, and interestingly, it's the same panel that will hear the second APT charges as heard the first last summer, which you would think would be bad news for the Premier League.
It should speed things up, that's one thing. But the process, if there is an appeal, it's a separate three-person commission. But the rules are, under Premier League rules, the commission that hears the like any disciplinary, like the Arne Slot one this week with the 2-match touchline ban, the same panel that sits on the case then determines the sentence. That's the way it works.
But just to jump in, I mean, it's interesting that for years it was the EFL, it was the Championship that was often seen as the kind of basket case where you had various clubs being dot points and in dispute with one another. And if in some ways they kind of saw the writing on the wall, and they kind of got a separate kind of independent unit to kind of look at these kind of affairs, a bit like what La Liga do in Spain. And in some ways, had the Premier League taken a similar course of action, it maybe would have deflected from some of the criticism that it's faced, not necessarily with Man City, but certainly with some of the other kind of PSR type cases that have been kind of knocking around over the last few years.
There is a misconception, isn't there, in all of these disciplinaries, that it's the competition, it's the FA, it's the Premier League who are determining the punishment.
They're the prosecutors.
They are the prosecutors. They are CPS, effectively. They lay out the facts as they see it. They lay out the case. It's then for the judiciary, the independent commission. We're talking about serious judges. Lord Dyson, former Master of the Rolls, has sat on the APT case.
Lord Panic for Manchester City, you remembered through various Brexit cases as well.
Lord Panic, who sat alongside Boris Johnson 2 weeks before he was forced to quit the House of Commons, but there you go. So we are talking about eminent QCs, senior judges. These are proper people. They're not just Joe Schmo off the street. We are talking about major figures who are going through every argument with a fine tooth comb. And that's why it's been difficult, I think, for fans to get their heads around. Because it's the FA's fault and it's the Premier League's fault. And, Premier League, Everton and Forest fans were blaming the Premier League for the punishments. And they didn't determine the punishments.
You mentioned those cases, that they were largely just about overspending on players, on recruitment, exceeding the £105 million over 3-year allowable losses. So a far more basic case.
Yes, and that still took months to bring to a hearing and months for a verdict. What's interesting about that is it feels to me that for quite a long time clubs were pressuring the Premier League to take action against rivals they perceived to be maybe sort of muddying the waters, spending too much, claiming COVID ad-backs, disguising spending. And then when the Forest and Everton verdicts dropped, they were, whoa. That was, why have we done this? The points deductions were a real shock. And now we have other clubs, Newcastle, Villa, United, saying we're really close to that line, and there's almost a bit of retrenchment. So
careful what you wish for.
What was really interesting was that a direct consequence of those decisions on Everton and Forest were a change in spending policies, which we saw in action after the season finished last year in May, where in that 2 or 3 week period, we had all these little swaps between clubs of players going from Villa and Everton and Newcastle, etc., to get round PSR. When previously they did just, it doesn't matter. So it thought that the action brought by the Premier League forced a change of thought processes from every member of the league.
Yeah.
Quite a few people are asking about the 115. So we originally thought this being 115 charges. Since then, recalculating them, it seems like 130 charges because the Premier League changed their statement after they originally issued the charges in February 2023. Interesting though as well, if you delve into some of them, some of the allegations relate to things that aren't even applicable to City, it would seem, like parts of the rule book relating to if you're relegated to the EFL. So it seems like it's just a tranche of sections of the rule book that have been levelled against City that, so it might not even be 130 charges really.
We'll find out eventually when we actually get to when we see the report from the full written reasons of the panel, because then for the first time we'll lay out exactly what they were charged with on the date of the hearing, because everything's been done confidentially. We weren't even officially told when it had started. The only reason people knew it had started is because they saw Panic and Lewis, etc., walking into the International Dispute Resolution Centre.
And the only reason we know some of the detail is because Der Spiegel published it in 2018. So we know the allegation that Roberto Mancini, when he was City manager, allegedly earned more from a related club owned by Sheikh Mansour in Abu Dhabi than he did from Manchester City at the time, almost doubled his salary. Should that have counted as Premier League club salary and therefore being counted against Manchester City's costs? I asked Mancini about this in 2020. He denied knowledge of it.
Won the FA Cup, Rob, I remember.
No, this was Mancini actually at a UEFA event. I asked Pep Guardiola actually whether or not it was the week it emerged, whether he had any similar arrangements. City hadn't got back to me with the written question, so I asked him. They've never got back to me on that at all. So it was just asking about these various arrangements.
On that point, it's one of the reasons why we're seeing such a proliferation in the multi-club ownership model, and owners potentially looking at those kind of models and thinking, right, this is an opportunity for us to be able to move things around the kind of network, kind of move costs around, share costs. And so it's something that regulators, the Premier League, UEFA really need to be aware of to ensure that purely by having that kind of model, you're not able to take advantage of the rules in that way.
Well, thanks to you all for helping us understand it a bit more. Simon Lee from Michigan de Rea, Martin Lipton, chief sports writer from The Sun, Matt Hughes of many outlets. Football Biz. Football Biz, yeah. Thanks so much, and thank you for all your questions as well. And thank you for your contributions, and hopefully we've managed to give you a bit of insight into this most complex, contentious and costly Premier League investigation into Manchester City, winner of the Premier League title 8 times since 2012. The Premier League have insisted that they have to uphold their rules. Manchester City insists they have a comprehensive body of evidence to defend their position. It was in December when these hearings ended, 12 weeks after starting. 12 weeks later, since the conclusion of those hearings, we're still waiting for the outcome. We could still be many weeks away from the outcome of a case that could potentially ultimately see Manchester City relegated from the Premier League with a heavy points deduction. It's going to be hugely consequential because Manchester City are owned by Abu Dhabi's Sheikh Mansour, Vice President of the United Arab Emirates. What diplomatic and geopolitical consequences could there be from a verdict that could be hugely embarrassing for the ownership and hugely tarnishing for the reputation of Manchester City? On the Sky News app and website, there's a longer written piece, there's an explainer as well to help you understand this case that little bit more. But thank you for joining us live on this Sky News online special into the Manchester City Premier League investigation.